an equipment planeswalker, a new Chandra, a million vehicles, and so much more. It must be Ether Drift time. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for our first daily dose of Ether Drift spoilers. So we just kicked off spoiler season a few hours ago with a huge stream from Wizards, and we have like a million cards to talk about. Honestly, it is one of the biggest spoiler days that we have ever had, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Ether Drift cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of the cards we talk about today, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Ether Drift. First up today, we get the Aetherspark, our first ever equipment planeswalker, and this card is kind of wild. So it's 4 mana for a 4 loyalty equipment planeswalker. It says as long as it's attached to a creature, it can't be attacked, and it has, whenever equipped creature deals combat damage during your turn, put that many loyalty counters on it, and then +1, you can attach it up to one target creature, and put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. -5, draw 2 cards, -10, add 10 mana of any one color. So the Aetherspark, it is a super duper weird planeswalker. First, if you're not putting this on a creature, it's going to be really bad because you really need the extra loyalty that you get from the creature that is equipped to attacking to really get value out of this card. Like, you're just never going to +1 your way up to making 10 mana or something. It's not actually realistic. So that's number one. You need the support of creatures to make this good. All of its loyalty abilities look really expensive, but you also get to make a ton of loyalty by attacking with the creature that's equipped to it. So I think it evens out, and I gotta say, with the Aetherspark, I'm not sure how good this card is, but I'm pretty confident that this card is either straight up busted and going to be like the best card or one of the best cards from the set, or it's going to be completely unplayable. Right now, I'm leaning towards this card is going to be super busted. It's colorless, so it goes in any deck. Kind of reminds me of the One Ring in a weird way, is this colorless card that can be really strong and generate card advantage that theoretically any deck can play. So if you think about the Aetherspark, we got a few things to unpack here. First, the fact that it can't be attacked when it's equipped to a creature is kind of a huge deal. That kind of makes it like Bestow in a weird way, where you can equip this as just a way to protect it. How did planeswalkers die most often? Is your planeswalker attacks them with their creatures, but if you just equip this to a creature, then that's off the table. It can still die. Your opponent can Hero's Downfall it, or Assassin's Trophy it, or use an artifact destruction spell on it. So there are ways to kill it, but your opponent can't just attack it down with creatures. So that by itself is really powerful. The other thing that is incredibly powerful that is easy to miss in first read of the Aetherspark is its ability to get loyalty when it's equipped, where it says whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage during your turn, put that many loyalty counters on it. It doesn't say combat damage to a player. So this makes it like Umezawa's Jitte. If you throw this on a creature, even if your opponent blocks it, you're still going to get the loyalty on the Aetherspark, which is a huge, huge deal. So if you think about how this works, I think this card might actually be busted. So think about a very simple scenario. You got a Fairy Mastermind on the battlefield, just a 2-powered flyer. You play the Aetherspark. You +1 to put it on Fairy Mastermind. Now Fairy Mastermind is up to 3 power. Then you attack your opponent with the Fairy Mastermind. That's going to add 3 more loyalty to the Aetherspark, so you have to 7 loyalty. The next turn, you attack again with the Fairy Mastermind. 3 more loyalty. You're up to 10, and now you can just make 10 mana. And if you make 10 mana with this, you should be able to pull really far ahead or just win the game on the spot. And that's with just a Fairy Mastermind. If you put on a bigger creature, it has potential to grow even faster. You could also just -5 pretty much every turn if you get it on a big creature and just have it be draw 2 extra cards, which kind of feels a little bit one-ringy in a weird way. As far as standard is concerned, we do have support for equipments. We got Nahiri and Jorkadine and Mabel, but honestly, I don't think you need to be an equipment deck for the Aetherspark to work. I think Wizards intentionally made this a card that even though it's an equipment, you can play in pretty much any deck. All this really asks of you is to have enough creatures to be able to equip it consistently, because all of its other abilities, drawing cards, making mana, are stuff that every deck is going to want. You're never going to be mad about drawing 2 extra cards or making 10 mana, so I don't think you need to be some janky equipment deck. I think you can jam this in pretty much any creature deck and get value out of it. Once you get back to older formats or Commander, then you get some interesting options. Stoneforge Mystic can tutor it up since it's an equipment. Enlightened Tutor can tutor it up since it's an artifact. So those seem like pretty interesting synergies. There's also some potential to make it even more explosive if you can equip it without using its +1. So I'm thinking like maybe a Hammer Time Shell where you got Sigarda's Aid and Pure Steel Paladin, you got Stoneforge to find it. You can play the Aetherspark, and let's say you have a Pure Steel, so you can equip it thanks to Pure Steel. Maybe you put your Colossal Hammer on there too. You attack with the Pure Steel, get a huge amount of loyalty thanks to its ability, and then you can use the -10 the turn that you played it, which might just let you win the game on the spot. So I think that's another possibility, is trying to find ways to get this onto creatures without having to use the +1, because then that opens up you using its other loyalty abilities during the same turn that you played it. In Commander, I think there's really 2 options. So option number 1 seems really good in Voltron decks. Imagine sticking this on Slicer and passing it around the table, and oh my god, it's going to get out of control really quick. Or even like Rafika the Many, Thrun. If you're building a Voltron threat, this seems like the perfect Planeswalker for your deck. You put it on your hard to deal with Commander, you get a ton of loyalty, you draw cards, you make mana. We've talked many times about how in Commander in specific, there's really only 2 things that matter, which is getting ahead on cards, getting ahead on mana. That's really determines who wins most games of casual Commander, and Aetherspark does both of those things, and it gets around the biggest downside of Planeswalkers in Commander, which is you have 3 opponents. So normally you play a Planeswalker, and since you have 3 opponents, someone can just attack it and kill it. But with the Aetherspark, if you get it on a creature, that's not going to happen nearly as often. So I feel like in a weird way, this is kind of designed for Commander, or at least better in Commander than most Planeswalkers. Also seems really sweet in equipment deck. You got like Serwyn, Captain America, Arden. They can all equip this without using the +1, so you can use its loyalty abilities right away. Plus, you're going to have a bunch of synergies for artifacts and equipments in these decks anyway. So the Aetherspark, I'm still undecided if this card is absolutely busted or unplayable, but I lean towards this one being super busted. I would not be surprised if, when we look back in 6 months or a year, if the Aetherspark is one of the best cards from this set and a hugely impactful card. Just being a colorless card opens up so many possibilities, and even though it's super unique and really weird, I think it has potential to be very, very powerful. We also got the return of my all-time favorite Magic character in Loot. Loot the Pathfinder. And honestly, as much as I don't especially like Loot, I think his card is kind of insane. So it's 5 mana Teamer for a 2/4 double strike Vigilance Haster. And then it has a new mechanic in Exhaust. So Exhaust 1 green, you can add 3 mana of any one color, exhaust 1 blue, draw 3 cards, exhaust 1 red, 3 damage to any target. So what does exhaust mean? And we're going to get more into exhaust in a minute when we talk about the mechanics, but it's actually pretty simple. All it means is you can only use the ability once for the entire game. So if you do the green exhaust, you can't use the green exhaust mode again. You can still use the blue exhaust because that's a separate exhaust, but you can only use each of those abilities a single time. Although it is worth mentioning, since people get confused by this, if you have a loot and you like blink loot or something, it's technically a new loot according to the game, and then you can start reusing the abilities again. Also, we get our look at one of my favorite treatments Wizards has ever done with the gold border treatment. I love gold border cards. I was not expecting them to come back in a standard set, but I absolutely love the super yellow borders. Let me know what you think, though. I know I was streaming earlier and asked Twitch chat about it, and pretty much everyone hated it, but I legitimately love it. It's one of my all-time favorite treatments that Wizards has done. It's so simple, but it just looks so incredibly cool. So what do we do with loot? So first, loot kind of reminds me of Kenrith the Return King, Garth the One-Eyed, kind of this like super value-y card. You don't gotta do anything to make this card good. It's just a huge pile of keywords and really powerful abilities, just like Kenrith or kind of like Garth. Garth also has the like only use it once thing, and you can blink it to reset it, so that's kind of the comparison there. So Loot, if you think about its abilities, it's kind of Black Lotus into Ancestral Recall into Lightning Bolt, which is some of the most powerful cards in the history of the game, and now you're going to have access to them in Standard, and it's even better than that because this has haste. So I think how you play Loot is you wait till you get up to 6 mana, you can play Loot, attack with it if you can, get in some damage since it has Vigilance, and then immediately use it to draw 3 cards, or deal 3 damage, or make some mana to play something else. If you think of this as a 6 mana 2/4 double strike Vigilance Haster that also ETBs draws 3 cards, that is a ridiculous ridiculous magic card, and that's not even including reusing it, which we've talked about. So yes, it is true that with Exhaust, you can only use each ability once, but if you reset loot by blinking it or bouncing it back to your hand and replaying it, then it's a new version of loot, and that all goes away and you can start using it again. So in Standard, we have cards like Splash Portal, where you can play your loot, use all your abilities, get the value, then just blink it for 1 mana and use them all again, or Essence Flux, Ephemera in older formats. So I expect this will be a very popular way to play with loot. In Standard, since our ramp is so good, it seems very possible to get this down on turn 3, like turn 1 Llanowar, turn 2 Overlord of the Hauntwoods, turn 3 loot. I don't know how you're going to end up losing that game. I'm sure in Commander, we'll also see some blink combo potential where you like pair it with Deadeye Navigator, so you can keep blinking it, and maybe Impact Tremor, so you're dealing damage as you blink it, and just use all the abilities a million times, or like Displacer Kitten, so when you cast a spell, you can blink it and reset it, then make some mana to cast another spell, or draw some cards to find a spell, so you can blink it to reset it and do it again. The card is absolutely insane. So loot the Pathfinder. I feel like this card's just busted. It is by far the best loot we've ever seen, and it's not even, I think, a tiny bit close. And I actually think this card is just really, really strong. It has so much text on it, and each of its abilities are so powerful that I have to think that this card is going to see some play in Standard, and I actually kind of hate it in Commander, not because it's loot, although maybe that's a little bit of the reason, but it's just such a good stuffy card where it doesn't really push in any direction, the same way I kind of dislike Kenrith, because it's just like a huge pile of abilities, and whatever good cards you play with it, you're going to get value out of it. Loot's kind of the same way. You don't got to do much work to get value out of loot. All you got to do is play it and activate its abilities, and it's probably going to take over the game. We also got a new Chandra in Chandra Spark Hunter. So, new Chandra, 4 mana, 4 loyalty. Static ability, at the beginning of combat in your turn, choose up to 1 target vehicle you control. Until end of turn, it becomes an artifact, creature, and gainsay. So essentially, you get to crew any vehicle that you control for free. +2, sack an artifact or discard a card. If you do, you draw a card. 0, create a 3/2 colorless vehicle artifact creature token with crew 1, which kind of snowballs with its static ability. Worst case with Chandra, you play it, you 0 it to make the 3/2 vehicle, turn that vehicle into a creature with haste with the static, smash your opponent for 3, and then -7, you get an emblem with whenever an artifact you control enters, 3 damage to any target. So an ultimate that, in a deck full of vehicles or artifacts, is going to win the game, but it's probably going to take, I don't know, 2-3 turns, something like that, depending on the situation. So Chandra, if you think about what it does, +2 is kind of a demand answers, I guess. I know demand answers you draw 2, but you got to think Chandra is kind of the second card with its +2. Then you can create a token that's basically a flywheel racer stats, no other abilities, and then repeated lightning bolts if you get to the emblem. I think that Chandra, it has potential to be a strong card, but it's got to be in the right deck. It's a pretty narrow card, right? Where you really want a deck full of vehicles to make Chandra worth it. I think the biggest upside to the card is really its static ability that can crew literally any vehicle for free. So Weatherlight completed. Even if you can't normally crew it, Chandra can turn it into a vehicle. All the new vehicles we're getting in Aetherspark, like Valor's Flagship, Chandra turns it on for free. Consulate Dreadnought, with its huge crew 6, doesn't matter, Chandra can turn it into a creature. So in a vehicle deck, that static is very, very strong, especially combined with the rest of the abilities. It also does synergize with Caretaker's Talent. I don't know if this is actually going to be good enough, but if you play our Caretaker's Talent on 3, on turn 4, you can Chandra, make the vehicle token, trigger the Caretaker's Talent to draw a card, keep that synergy going every turn. The thing about Chandra is it feels like an aggro card, but I don't think you really want to play it in a deck like Mono Red. I think it's probably too slow for Mono Red. Yeah, it's nice that you can make the hasty 3/2 vehicle and smack your opponent, but that's for 4 mana. If you think about Mono Red, they kind of want your opponent to be dead by turn 4, not like making a 3/2 vehicle on turn 4. So I think that Chandra is really going to need a vehicle deck to develop. At this point, it's just too early to say. We know we're getting a ton of vehicles in Aether Drift. Maybe we're going to have a deck with them. If there's a deck with them, I think Chandra could definitely be a part of it. Otherwise, it's hard for me to see Chandra really being that strong outside of some sort of dedicated vehicle list. Speaking of vehicles, we got a new mythic vehicle in the Last Ride. So the Last Ride, 1 mana for a 13/13 legendary vehicle, but it gets cost, -X, where X is your life total. Then you can pay 3 and 2 life to draw a card, and it crews for 2. So if this sounds kind of familiar, this is the car the Death Shadow would ride. It's literally a Death Shadow as a vehicle, with the upside of kind of having a more expensive greed attached to it, which is nice because you can use it to lower your life total to eventually turn on the last ride. So this card is very intriguing to me. The comparison to Death Shadow, I mean, it's obviously an apt one, right? It's literally the same card, but there are a couple of twists here. So the most notable twist is last ride is a Death Shadow that you can always play on turn 1. One of the downsides of Death Shadow is if you play it before the life total is low enough, it's just going to die, right? It's going to give itself such a big -X that it just dies to its own ability. The last ride, though, it's only going to get -X if it's a creature. It can get -1,000,000, as long as it's not a creature, and it's not going to die. So this is a Death Shadow effect that you can just slam on turn number 1. On the other hand, there is a downside. This is a Death Shadow effect that's going to require some support to actually be able to attack. Like, and this is my biggest concern in like modern Death Shadow or Legacy Death Shadow. I'm just not sure those decks have enough cheap creatures to pay the crew too. Like, if you have to tap a Death Shadow to crew the last ride, you're kind of defeating the whole purpose of everything, because you can just attack with the Death Shadow. So it's going to take a different kind of Death Shadow build for this to really shine. So I think this is a really cool and flavorful card. I'm not sure this card is super strong. I think in Standard, maybe it has some uses. I like the card advantage mode, but we never really got to see Death Shadow be good in Standard, and I'm not sure the plan of like aggressively lowering your own life total is going to be a very good one in a world where Gruul and Mono Red and burn spells are so popular and so powerful. So I don't know if it's going to see a lot of play. I do think it could serve a purpose is like Death Shadows 5 and 6 in Modern, but like I said, it might take a bit of a rebuild to make sure you have a way to actually crew it and turn it on once you get to that point, but it's just a super cool design. Speaking of vehicles, we also got Thunderous Volocipede. So 3-mana green vehicle for a 5/5 with trample, crew 3, and it says each other vehicle and creature you control enters with an additional +1/+1 counter if its mana value is 4 or less. Otherwise, it enters with 3 additional +1/+1 counters. So if you cast a cheap creature, it gets 1 counter, or vehicle. If you cast a more expensive one, it comes into play with 3 counters. And I love vehicles like this. This is a vehicle that has fine stats, right? 3-mana 5/5 trampler. The crew cost is kind of high. It's got fine stats, but you don't need this to actually be a creature to get value out of it. Just sitting out as an artifact as you play other creatures, play other vehicles to get the counters, that is perfectly fine. The question is, where's this card going to fit? So we got Llanowar Elf, so we can rush this out on turn number 2, which seems pretty powerful, and then you just play a bunch of creatures, and they all get super big. Probably some sort of like +1/+1 counter theme deck. We got Cameo of Whispered Hopes, we have Bristlybill, we got Ozolith. In a deck like that, the extra counters from Thunderous Volocipede going to be especially helpful because that's kind of what your deck's trying to do, and it synergizes with all of your other pieces. So I could see it seeing play there. I'm not sure about just playing it as a generic threat. Plus, green is just not a very good place. We haven't seen like mono green Stompy really take off in Standard. Also super cute in decks that can make a lot of tokens. Notice it doesn't say non-token creature. So if you use Song of Tatanzan and make like 10 hasty rats, they're all going to get a +1/+1 counter. If you Hair Apparent a bunch of times and make a bunch of rabbit tokens, everything's getting the counters. So I feel like this is a card that is actually very powerful. Like, just in the right deck, some sort of go wide deck or a vehicle deck, just the ability to have all of your stuff come into play a little bit bigger. This is going to add a ton of power to the battlefield over the course of a few turns. And then when the timing's right and the coast is clear, you can always screw it up and smash your opponent for 5 with trample. So I think this card, not sure exactly where it fits outside of the +1/+1 counter decks, which admittedly are like tier 3 decks in Standard. We don't really have a normal green deck to put it in, so I'm not exactly sure the card's here home, but I do think this is a card that is definitely powerful enough to see Standard play. We also got a white mythic vehicle in Valor's Flagship. So 7 mana for a 7/7 flying first strike lifelinker with crew of 3, but then it has cycling of 3 and X. And when you cycle this card, you create X 1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens that saddle mounts and crew vehicles vehicles, although its power was 2 greater. So essentially they can crew 3 even though they're just 1/1s. Valor's Flagship. This one is very interesting to me. So if you think about what this card is, it's kind of like a huge Baneslayer Angel vehicle. There's also a Decree of Justice, where you can cycle it to make a bunch of 1/1s. The 1/1s work especially well in a vehicle deck. So in Standard, I think this card could have some uses. I'm mostly looking at it as a reanimation target. It's 7 mana. You could just be casting like an Atroxa or something, which is probably going to be better in most decks. But I think the upside of this card is you can cycle it early to get it in the graveyard, and then you can like one last job, 4 mana, reanimate it, and have this massive vehicle. Or Invasion of Tavolda, reanimate it, have this massive vehicle. So I think that's probably going to be the best use of this card. And this is a vehicle so far that I think is most likely to make it in Greasefang and Pioneer. It's not going to replace Parhelion. Parhelion still just has the upside of adding an insane amount of power. It's always a 2-turn clock, right? Once it starts doing its thing. Valor's Flagship, not quite that good as far as the amount of power it adds, but the upside of Valor's Flagship is twofold. First, you can cycle it to get it in the graveyard, so if you don't draw your self-mill or whatever and you draw your Flagship, it's like a Parhelion that can just discard itself when you need to. The other upside is, it's a nice backup plan if things go wrong. If your graveyard gets shut down, Parhelion's like the worst card in your deck. If your graveyard gets shut down with Valor's Flagship, well, worst case, you cycle it, make some 1/1s, crew your other vehicles, try to win fairly. So I do think that the Greasefang decks in Pioneer, probably going to try a couple copies. Again, you're not taking Parhelion out of the deck. Not saying that at all, but on top of Parhelion, it seems pretty good. It also could be sweet in Standard in a vehicle deck. I think that's where you could really see the pilots shine. Being able to cycle this to make a bunch of pilots, they can easily crew Thunderous Volocipedes and so forth. So maybe it's good in a vehicle deck there too. So Valor's Flagship, definitely the biggest vehicle we've seen so far, and probably the most likely to make it outside of Standard. We also got a couple of new Gearhulks, 2-color Gearhulks, and we kick things off with our Dimir Gearhulk, Oildeep Gearhulk. So 4 mana 4/4, including double blue, double back, which is honestly one of my biggest concerns with the card is 2-colored mana symbols in 2 different colors can be a little tricky to cast, although at least Oildeep's in the best 2 colors for Standard, I guess, like Dimir and Esper at the top of the meta, so there are tier decks that could slot this in. So you get a 4 mana 4/4 with Lifelink Ward 1, and it says when it enters, look at target player's hand. You can choose a card from it. When you do, that player discards that card and then draws a card. So Oildeep Gearhulk, this card is very interesting to me. So far, I have mostly seen people just trashing this card and saying it's bad. I don't think that's true. Like, it's a 4 mana 4/4 with lifelink and a ward. Like, its stats are fine. The combination of lifelink and a decent body, that is enough to have me intrigued by the card. Think of like Aclazotz or Kalitas, these kind of mid-range life gain threats where you're playing against mono red, you're playing against Gruul, and you just want to be able to drop something that's going to gain you some life, stabilize the board. I think that Oildeep Gearhulk is probably going to serve that purpose. So I think its stats in its abilities by itself are fine. And then you get to its enters trigger, which I think is sneakily powerful. So it's kind of like a Vendilion Click, right? You make your opponent discard a card, but then they get to draw a card. Vendilion Click puts it on the bottom, kind of like a Thought-Knot Seer, except a worse Thought-Knot Seer in a lot of ways, because Thought-Knot just exiles a card. This makes you discard, and then you don't get to draw until Thought-Knot dies. This lets you draw right away. So it's kind of a twist on these cards. So level 1 is, you just cast this and use it like a weird Thought Seize, right? You look at your opponent's hand, you take their best card. They do get to draw a random card, but in theory, if you're taking their best card, the random card that they draw should be worse than that card. So it's not a full Thought Seize effect, but still, it's going to disrupt your opponent's plans and diminish the quality of their hand. But what really sold me on Oildeep Gearhulk is you can also use this on yourself. Notice, it doesn't say, look at target opponent's hand. It says target player's hand. So one of the tricks you can do with Oildeep Gearhulk is just play it in essentially loot, where you play this, you look at your own hand, maybe you discard an Atroxa or a Velgavoth. So then the next turn you can Cruelty of Gix or Zombify to reanimate it. That seems like a nice synergy for this card as well. So I think it's fine as like a bad Thought-Knot Seer with a better body in a lot of ways thanks to lifelink and ward, but it also could be synergistic in some sort of like reanimation deck where you're using this to target yourself. Also worth mentioning, it just says card, not non-land card. Usually this card says non-land card. So I don't know, in Commander, maybe this snags a Cabal Coffers or a Nykthos or your opponent's Tron land in Modern, although I don't think you're really playing this in Modern. But that is a neat twist that we haven't really seen on these cards in the past. Being able to hit lands, I don't think it really matters too much in Standard. especially since your opponent gets to draw another card, so you can't really use it like land destruction to try to mana screw your opponent. Odds are they'll just draw into another one anyway, but if there is a specific land you're worried about, this does get the job done. So Oildeep Gearhulk, the other reason to be encouraged by it in Standard is, like I said, it's in good colors. It's in the colors of This Sound Ain't Big Enough, Hopeless Nightmare, the most played colors in Standard right now. I'm not sure where this fits in those decks. It's a little expensive to be bouncing back to your hand with this down. 4 mana, kind of a lot to be replaying constantly, but he is in the right color, so I think Oildeep Gearhulk, I think this card's actually a good Standard card. We'll see where it fits. Maybe it doesn't have a home right away, even though it is in the right colors, but I can see like the near mid-range wanting this card, some sort of Esper control deck wanting this card. I think the combination of reasonable lifelinking body and a pretty powerful and oddly flexible enters trigger should be enough for this card to see play, even though so far I've mostly seen people poo-pooing this card, which I guess is partly because the last Gearhulks were so good. Like Torrential Gearhulk was a modern playable card when it first released. This is not going to be on that level, I don't think, but still a somewhat watered down Thought-Knot Seer with a lifelinking body seems like the kind of card that should be able to see play in Standard at least. We also got our Gruul Gearhulk in Pyrewood Gearhulk. So Pyrewood Gearhulk, 6 mana, 7/7 Vigilance Menace, says when it enters, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Menace until end of turn. Damage can't be prevented this turn. So Pyrewood Gearhulk, this one I'm not exactly sold on. This one I think might actually be kind of bad. So yes, it's got good stats. 6 mana, 7/7. That is a big creature. Vigilance Menace, nice. You can play some offense, defense, swing blast, a blocker, but these aren't like groundbreaking stats. We got Quilled Great Worm in Standard right now, 6 mana, 7/7 Trampler with some upsides. I mean, Vorse Claw is a 6 mana, 7/7 common that no one pays any attention to. So just being a 6 mana, 7/7, even with Vigilance and Menace, that's not enough to make a card playable. So if this card's going to be good, it's going to be because of its ETB trigger, which is other creatures you control get +2/+2 Vigilance and Menace until end of turn. When I first saw this, I was like, okay, it's kind of an Endraze Forerunners, right? The Pain Bacon, where it's kind of a mini Craterhoof itself. You play it, you pump your team, you get in some damage. The problem I see here is Pyrewood Gearhulk doesn't have haste itself. The upside of something like Endraze Forerunners or Craterhoof Behemoth is you play it and you get to pump your other creatures, but you also get this massive trampler that's going to smash your opponent for a bunch of damage by itself. Pyrewood Gearhulk, yes, in the right scenario where you go super wide, your opponent doesn't have removal, they don't Sunfall you, you can cast it and pump a whole bunch of creatures, it's going to be great, but it's not going to be very great. It's your opponent's killing your stuff and Sunfalling you and wrathing your board, because on an empty board, this is actually a pretty, it's Vorse Claw. It's actually very close to just being a Vorse Claw, which is not a standard playable card. So I actually think Pyrewood Gearhulk might be the weakest Gearhulk we've seen so far. Like, yeah, maybe you play in some sort of Timmy deck for fun, but it doesn't seem very good. The one thing it has going for it is it does absolutely destroy the fog meta. Damage can't be prevented. I don't think this is super relevant at the moment. It's not like we have a fog deck in Standard. The One Ring's banned in Modern. Not that you're gonna really play the 6-drop in Modern probably anyway. But if we do end up in a meta where fogs matter, people are casting damage prevention effects, One Ring effects, things like that, then Pyrewood Gearhulk does go a little bit up in value just because it totally stops those cards from working. So Pyrewood Gearhulk, it's big, it's got a lot of stats, but I'm just not sure it's actually going to be that playable in any deck. Also, for all you frog lovers out there, we got a new god in Sab-Sunen Luxa Embodied. 5 mana, 6/6 legendary god. It's a Simic card. It's got reach, trample, and indestructible, because it's a god, it gotta be indestructible. It says it can't attack or block unless it has an even number of counters on it. 0 is even, so you can block and attack the turn it comes into play. And then it says, at the beginning of your first main phase, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Then if it has an odd number of counters on it, draw 2 cards. So how this works, and I love this callback, it's basically Bounty of Luxa, which I guess has to do with Sab-Sunen because it's a Luxa thing. That's the god of Bounty of Luxa, I guess. So the way this is going to work in practice is just like Bounty of Luxa. So you play Sab-Sunen Luxa Embodied. The first turn, it's got 0 counters, so it's even, so you can block with it. The next turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. You can't attack or block with it. We're going to get to draw 2 cards, so you get a Divination. The next turn, you get a second counter, so you're back to an even number. You can attack and block. The next turn, draw 2 cards. If this sits out on the battlefield, it is a lot of value. Like, you're essentially drawing an extra card each turn and getting a pretty big creature every other turn. So being able to just repeatedly divination seems fine. It adds up to essentially drawing a card each turn cycle if you think about it. There are some ways to break this ability. I think the best is Innkeeper's Talent. Also, Ornery Tumbleway can do it. But the idea here is, if you have one of these cards out with Sab-Sunen, you can draw 2 cards every turn and have a real creature every turn. So you go to your upkeep, you get a counter from Sab-Sunen's ability to give it an odd number of counters, which means you get to draw 2 cards. But then you go to combat, Innkeeper's Talent puts a counter on Sab-Sunen. So you have an even number of counters, so you can attack with it and hit your opponent. Then your next turn, same thing. But in your first main phase, it gets a counter, it's odd, you draw 2 cards. Combat, Innkeeper's Talent puts a counter on it, smash your opponent for now 8 damage thanks to the counters or whatever. Ornery Tumbleway can do the same thing with its counters. So maybe some deck like this could really power this up. If this is a real creature every turn that's also drawing you 2 cards every turn, then Sab-Sunen is absolutely insane. So I think the card can be really good if you build around it. It is worth mentioning that Indestructible maybe not as great as you'd think in current standard, just because Sunfall exists, exile removal like Leyline Binding exists. So this is a card that wants to sit out for a few turns. We'll see how it lines up with the meta. This is one of the cards that really makes me dislike Sunfall. Like, I want good Wrath in the format, I just don't really want him to exile cool cards like Sab-Sunen, because I really want this card to see play, because it's a frog god, it's hilarious. So we'll see how it lines up with the meta. In Commander, I don't think you got to do anything to make this card good. I think it's just a good Simic card. Like, it draws you cards, it's pretty big. If you think about it, it's kind of a Phyrexian arena that doesn't lose life. Yes, it's kind of split up by the fact that one turn you draw 0, the next turn you draw 2, but it still averages out to drawing an extra card each turn. Plus, if you're playing some sort of counter shenanigan deck, then this card can get really, really insane. So, Sab-Sunen and Lux Embodied. I really love the design on this card. I love the callback to Bounty of the Luxa. I think it's a powerful card. It can generate a huge amount of card advantage. We'll just have to see if Sunfall ends up being a deal breaker. Next up, we got to talk about 2 of the big new mechanics from the set, starting with Start Your Engines. So these are the Start Your Engines cards we've seen so far. We're going to talk about them one by one, but I want to talk about the mechanic real quick first, because it's a little bit weird. So Start Your Engines, here's how it works. So when you play a Start Your Engines card, if you haven't played one previously in the game, you're going to have 0 speed. So your speed will start at 1 when you play the first one. Then it increases once on each of your turns when your opponent loses life, and your max speed is 4. So essentially, let's say you play Hazoret Godseeker, your speed is going to be 1, assuming you hadn't played any Start Your Engine stuff earlier or whatever, so you start at 1. Your opponent takes damage the next turn, it increases, the next turn it increases. Once you get to 4, it can't go any higher, but that's really where you want to be, because if you look at these cards, almost all of them are kind of medium before you get to max speed, but once you get to max speed, they can do some crazy things for a cheap price. So it's kind of a mechanic where you're paying with time in a weird way, almost like Suspend, where you're like waiting for your cards to become good, but then once you get to full speed, it's kind of like the City's Blessing. You're going to be full speed for every card for the rest of the game, and everything you play with the mechanic is going to be super powered. So I kind of think of it as a cross between like Suspend, just because you got to wait time for this to build up, and so far we haven't seen any way to cheat on the time. Maybe there'll be something in the set, but we haven't seen a way to be like, put yourself to max speed right away or something, which would be absolutely absurd. So we haven't seen a way to cheat on it. So it's a mechanic that involves waiting time for it to build up. Also kind of like the City's Blessing, in that once you get it, you're going to have it forever. So as far as these cards themselves, let's start with Hazoret Godseeker, and this one is very, very interesting. 2 mana, 5/3 indestructible haste. It has Start Your Engines. You can pay 1 and tap it to make target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn, but it can't attack or block unless you have max speed. So if you think about Hazoret, 2 mana, 5/3 haste, indestructible, absolutely absurd, right? If you could just play this on turn 2 and smash your opponent, it would literally be the best card in Standard, or one of the best cards in Standard. It would be so incredibly strong. But thanks to Start Your Engines, I'm not sure how good this is. If you play this on turn 2, and then turn 3 your speed ticks up, turn 4 your speed turns up, turn 5 your speed turns up, finally turn 5, you actually have a Hazoret that's going to be able to attack and block. Is that going to be good enough? I actually don't know. And if you ever miss a turn of having your opponent lose life, you're not going to increase your speed that turn. Very, very difficult to figure out. I'm not sure if this mechanic is actually really strong, because once it gets going, it's hard to interact with and it just builds up and always sits there. And then eventually all your cards are going to be supercharged, or if it's just a little bit too slow to get going, especially for a card like Hazoret that looks like an aggro card. So I do really love the design of this for the gods, because traditionally gods have some sort of restriction that keeps them from being able to attack and block right away. Like Hazoret the Fervent, you'd have one or less cards in hand. This is kind of the same thing with Start Your Engines, except you just gotta wait time and maybe damage your opponents a little bit to eventually turn these on. So is Hazoret gonna be good? I'm actually not sure. So if you think about red aggro, I feel like somehow this 2-mana 5/3 Indestructible Haste is actually just too slow. We talked about if you play it on turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, you could probably theoretically actually turn it into a real creature on turn 5. But by that time, if you're playing mono red or Gruul, you probably want your opponent dead by turn 5, not just getting a 5/3 Indestructible on turn 5. There are things you can do with it in the meantime. You can use its ability to like make a Heartfire hero unblockable, trigger Valiant, or make a Slick Shot unblockable to get in some more damage. It's also just a very good crewer. It's a 2-mana indestructible crewer that can crew literally every vehicle we've seen so far. We haven't seen anything with a crew high enough that Hazoret couldn't crew it. So maybe that's Hazoret's job, is just to sit around indestructibly and be able to crew up and crew vehicles. The other concern I have with Hazoret, outside of its slowness, is something we've talked about before, which is like Sunfall Leyline Binding, but that had nowhere to run in the mix, and nowhere to run is everywhere right now. So I feel like the fact that nowhere to run can just snipe this super easily might actually be the deal breaker that keeps it from seeing play. So Hazoret Godseeker, I want to know what you think of this card. When I first read this card, I was like, oh my god, this is so busted. Then I thought about it more, and I was like, I don't know, maybe it's too slow. But now I'm like, oh, it's only 2 mana, maybe it's still busted. So very difficult card to figure out. Let me know what you think about new Hazoret. What do you think about the mechanic? How good is this mechanic? Is it too slow? Is it going to be playable? We also got Mendicant Core Guidlight. So a 2-mana star 3 robot. Its power is equal to the number of artifacts you control. It is Start Your Engines, so same deal. And then if you get to max speed, whenever you cast an artifact spell, you can pay 1. If you do, copy that spell, which is an incredibly strong ability. And we're going to see this time and time again with these Start Your Engine cards, that a lot of them are like pretty medium before you get to max speed, but then once you get to max speed, you're like, oh my god, that's insanely broken. So maybe the way the mechanic works is it actually rewards you for trying to turbo into it and play cheap cards to get your engine started as fast as possible and start the process going, because once you get to max speed, your deck is just going to be so powerful, it's worth it. So Mendicant Core, it's kind of like a upgraded legendary sampling shoe, mixed with, I guess, a Mirror Works is the closest thing to its max speed ability, which that ability is legitimately wild. Like, if you get that going, paying 1 to copy any artifact you cast is so strong. But I feel like this is a pretty good aggro threat in the right deck. If you're some sort of artifact aggro deck, maybe Jotun Frontliners and Sir Gingers, if you can make 3 colors work, maybe Tough Cookies, this is just a really big body. You play it, it's probably going to be, I don't know, a 2-mana 4/3 or 5/3 once you get going. That's pretty fine on its own. And then once you get to max speed, should you actually have the game go that long, then you can play a Frontliner and copy it, play a Tough Cookie for 1 mana and copy it, which is just going to take over the game super quick. The only challenge I see here is, right now, if you think about artifact aggro decks, the most popular is definitely like the Simic Cookie deck. Can you actually make this fit in that deck? Can you make 3 colors work with the current standard mana? We'll have to wait and see, but that's the kind of deck that can take advantage of this. And then once you get to max speed, you can do all kinds of things with this card. Imagine copying a Portal to Phyrexia, Phyrexian Flesh Gorder, Skitterbeam Battalion. It's just going to take over the game in 1 or 2 turns once you get it going. So I'm not sure we have a clear home for this card in Standard, but I do think it's of a power level where, if we can find the right support, this could be a key 2-drop in a really good Standard deck. We also got a new Homunculus in Vnwxt? I don't know. You're supposed to add your own vowels in there. It's like Flibblefib. So our Verbose host, a 2-mana 0/4 would Start Your Engines. You have no max hand size, and if you get to max speed, if you draw a card, you get to draw 2 cards instead. And this is a card that, as much as I love Flibblefib and Homunculus is, I just don't see as Standard playable. It's like a Reliquary Tower mixed with Thought Reflection. I do appreciate that it doesn't exclude the first card that you draw each turn, so once you actually get to max speed, Worst case, you're on 2 cards a turn. If you got more card draw, you can draw even more. Although the problem I see with Vnwxt is it has no power. And if you think about Start Your Engines, not only do you need to play a Start Your Engines card, you need an opponent to be losing life each turn to increase your speed. So this doesn't really help increase your speed because it doesn't have any power. So I feel like it's going to be a very difficult card to actually use effectively in Standard. I would maybe jam it in Commander, especially my Flibblethip deck for flavor purposes, but otherwise, I think this is mostly just a meme card. We also got Zahur Glory's Past, a 2-mana 3/2 Orzhov Zombie Cat Warrior. It has Start Your Engines. You can sack another creature to surveil one only once each turn, unfortunately, and then once you get to max speed, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. So this card, the sack ability is pretty bad. That's the biggest issue I have with this card. If you think about decks that would want this, aristocrat-style decks, you really want sack outlets like Viscera or Woestrider that let you sack as many things as you want each turn. Sacking one thing each turn, I don't think I've ever seen a sack outlet like that see play. The good news for this card is once you get to max speed, you turn into a cheaper Rotling Reanimator or Xanthrid Necromancer, cards that have seen a lot of play in the past that doesn't even care about creature types. Like the max speed ability of whenever non-token creature you control dies, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token that's tapped. That is a really, really powerful effect. Either as Wrath Protection, where you make some creatures, your opponent wraths the board, you get a bunch of 2/2s, or as a combo piece where you can like sack something, get a zombie, sack the zombie to get even more value. But I think that the fact that its sack ability is so lacking might keep it from seeing play. If this card's going to see play, it's probably going to be in something like our Mean Girl sack deck that we played. We also got Bloodghast returning to Standard, which is so good for sack decks because you can sack it and then make a land drop and sack it again. So in something like our Mean Girl sack deck, if we make the mana work, I would probably consider playing like a copy of this, maybe 2 copies, not for its sack ability, which is admittedly very, very lackluster, but for its last ability. If we can get to max speed, the ability to like sack a Bloodghast, make a 2/2 zombie that we then sacrifice, and then play a land, get back the Bloodghast, sack the Bloodghast, make another zombie sacrifice, that is so much sack fodder for an aristocrat style deck. So I think the card has uses, but I think you're going to want to back it up with a better sack outlet rather than using it as a sack outlet. I think you use this as an on-curve 2-drop that also has a really powerful max speed ability, not so much as a Woestrider of a Seer. We also got Far Fortune Endboss, a 4-mana 4/5 human mercenary with Start Your Engines. It says whenever you attack, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So this is whenever you attack with any amount of creatures. So if you attack with 1 creature, you get 1 damage to everyone. If you attack with 100 creatures, you get 1 damage to everyone. And then it has max speed. If a source you control would deal damage to an opponent or permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 1 instead. So this card kind of reminds me of a Torbrand or a Mechanized Warfare, a Valley of Flamecaller, one of these cards that gives you a little bit more damage, and I think that it has some uses. I could imagine a deck where you have like Razorkin Needlehead, so when your opponent draws, they take a damage. Maybe Firebrand Archer, Crustacean Mage, so when you cast spells, your opponent takes a damage. If you can get to max speed with this out, you can probably just kill your opponent with all these 1 damage pingers, turning into 2 damage pingers to essentially double your clock. I think that's the strongest use of this card. In Commander, at first I was like, oh, this might be a very popular Commander, but then I thought about it and I was like, actually, this is kind of just Vel'Gavoth, Terror of Souls at home. It wants all the same cards that Vel'Gavoth wants, because you want to be able to repeatedly deal damage to your opponents. So Fate Unravelers and Mana Barb's going to be good in both decks, but I think Vel'Gavoth, it just came out a couple of months ago, or a couple of sets ago, I guess, maybe more than a couple of months now, but it's a very, very popular Commander. So I think people who are thinking about building Far Fortune might just build Vel'Gavoth instead. So I think Far Fortune. The other thing I want to mention about this card in Standard is these expensive Start Your Engine cards really show the importance of having cheaper Start Your Engine cards in the deck. If you just play this on turn 4 as your first Start Your Engines card, you are not going to hit max speed until like turn 7, turn 8, and the game's probably going to be over. Where this card is going to be at its best is if you can start your engines early in the game, and then by the time this comes down, already have max speed going. In that context, then this card can be very good. I mean, 4 mana, 4/5, those are Shieldred stats. Shieldred made it in Standard as a legendary creature, so I'm not saying it's like a deal breaker. It's just going to take some building around. I think as a one-of standalone Start Your Engines card, this card's not going to be good enough. I mean, we got Mishra doing something kind of similar in Standard to like drain with attacks in the same colors, and no one plays that card. I think that's just better in that shell. So if you're not going to get to max speed, I feel like this card's kind of useless, but if you can play it in a max speed deck, maybe it could be the top end of the curve. Speaking of cheap ways to start max speed earlier, we have 3 lands, Moraganda Raceway, Amonkhet Raceway, Avishkar Raceway. So these lands are all very similar. They all have Start Your Engines. They all come into play tapped. They all make a colorless mana. And then once you get to max speed, they do something pretty powerful. Avishkar's Raceway, max speed, actually not that great. 3 mana to loot, plus you gotta tap it. So it's technically 4 mana to loot. Not super exciting, but that's the common. Amonkhet Raceway and max speed, tap it to give target creature haste. Might be the second best haste land in all of Magic behind Arena of Glory, assuming you can get to max speed. And then Moraganda Raceway, once you get to max speed, it just taps for 2 mana. It turns into a painless Ancient Tomb. So these cards, this mechanic is so hard to evaluate without playing with it. I really am struggling with this one. I'm not sure if these cards are busted or unplayable. There's good news, which is their max speed modes are really, really strong. And the other upside I see of these cards is they are ways that you can start your engines as early as turn 1. And we were talking about, with like our last card, 4 Faction End Boss, how you really want max speed to start building up early in the game. These are some of the best ways to do it. It's a little awkward to turn 1 play a colorless land. Maybe that's a deal breaker, but these are ways you can start the engine super, super early. So by the time you start playing your 4 Faction End Boss, you're actually going to already have max speed and get full value out of your cards. So I think that's a huge upside. On the other hand, how many colorless lands can you play? Do you get to max speed fast enough? Those are the questions we don't have answers to. So all in all, I am incredibly intrigued by this mechanic. I think Start Your Engines, at first glance, it feels a bit slow to me, but it's a very difficult mechanic to evaluate without actually playing with, and it might turn out if you jam a bunch of Start Your Engines cards together, they all power each other up so much because the max speed modes are so powerful that there's actually a powerful max speed deck out there. The other place I'd consider playing these lands is in Commander decks. I think especially Moraganda Raceway, Amonkhet Raceway. I think in Commander, you can afford some colorless lands. They both have max speed effects that you want. And in Commander, in theory, you got 3 opponents. Hopefully you can chip in at damage at someone each turn. And even if you're not turning on Moraganda Raceway until turn 4, turn 5, turn 6, I mean, people play Temple of the False Gods, which is an even worse soul land that does literally nothing on turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. People play that card like a staple, so I imagine that Moraganda Raceway probably makes it there as well. And Amonkhet Raceway is not far behind. Just tap to give haste is so, so good. Next up, we have the other big mechanic from the set, an Exhaust. And we already talked about Exhaust a little bit with loot. It is an incredibly simple mechanic for the most part. So the simpleness of this is, all it means is you can only use this ability once each game. So once you use an Exhaust, you have exhausted that ability. There are ways around this, right? If you have the creature die and reanimate it, if you bounce it back to your hand and replay it, if you blink it even, like Ephemerate or something like that, that'll make it a new version of the card and you can use it again. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. The only thing that I dislike about some of the cards with this mechanic is there's not a good way of tracking them. Like Redshift Rocketeer is an example, and maybe it's not the best example because its ability is 12 mana, but once you activate its ability, there's nothing that's really marking it to let you know that you've already used it. I think Loot's actually probably the worst at that because it's got 3 abilities and none of them mark in any way. So that'd be my one criticism of this. But this is basically all those once per turn mechanics that we've been getting, but once per game instead. So these cards, we have Winter Cursed Rider, 2 mana, 3/2 with Ward of Pay 2 life. Artifacts you control also have Ward of Pay 2 life. And then Exhaust, 4 mana, including a blue and a black. Tap it, exile X artifact cards from your graveyard. Each non-artifact creature gets -X until end of turn. So Winter, I think, is a fine card. It's just a fine card that I don't know where you actually play it. You need some sort of artifact deck that's also filling the graveyard, and then you get some protection with its ward, and then eventually maybe like a Wrath out of it. But even that's kind of awkward, because if you're a heavy artifact deck, Winter's not an artifact. You want a non-artifact card in your artifact deck. So it's a card that I think could have uses. Like, if you actually exhaust it and wrath your opponent's board, that's a very powerful 2-drop. I'm just not sure we have a deck like that exists in Standard, but we'll have to wait and see what develops. We also got Redshift Rocketeer Chief. So this is our Gruul 2-drop. 2 mana for a 2/3. It's a Goblin Pilot with Vigilance. It taps to make X mana of any one color, where X is its power, but you can only spend the mana on abilities. The good news is, it has an ability. For 12 mana, you can put any number of permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. One of the most expensive activated abilities that we've ever seen in Magic, but it's a powerful one, right? If you actually get there and have cards in hand, you just dump them all into play and probably win the game. So Redshift kind of intrigues me. So its mana making ability, it's kind of like Enigma Jewel, which is a card that we haven't really seen caught on yet, although Redshift comes along with a 2/3 body, which is nice. That's an upside. And then its last ability, we don't have anything that is exactly like just dump all the permanents from your hand into play, but it's kind of like a personal Eureka, maybe a Genesis Ultimatum that doesn't draw you cards but lets you put everything into play. If you get to that and you still have cards left in hand, it probably is going to win you the game. There is some combo potential here. The easiest way to go infinite, cards like Umbra Mantle or Sword of the Pair-Runes, put one of these on a Redshift, and you can tap Redshift to make mana, and then since Umbra Mantle or Sword of the Pair-Runes have untap abilities, you can use that mana to untap them, then you tap it again to make mana. Essentially, you make infinite mana for abilities, and then you can use its exhaust ability as an ability to put all the stuff from your hand into play, and that should be able to win you the game. So I think if you're playing Commander with this, Umbra Mantle, Sword of the Pair-Runes, I know they combo with a lot of things, but they're going to be really good in a Redshift deck. As far as Standard is concerned, the question is, what are we spending this mana on? So obviously, the Against the Odds dream world is we draw a ton of cards, we get to 12 mana, we put our deck into play, and it's amazing. But assuming that's not happening, what are we doing with ability mana? And the best I could think of is it works really well with crafting, right? Like, we have a lot of craft abilities. Those are abilities that we can spend Redshift's mana on. We can use that mana to level up enchantments, like class enchantments. There's even creatures like Hired Claw. You could tap this to pay for Hired Claw's ability. On the other hand, we have like Agatha in Standard, which reduces the cost of abilities as a 2-drop Gruul creature, and no one has really played that, so we haven't seen anyone really crack the ability deck yet, but maybe Redshift's a card to make it work. Really though, I just want to ramp into his exhaust ability and put everything into play, because that sounds absolutely hilarious, and in Commander in specific, I feel like that's going to be very, very scary. This is a 2-drop that is going to be kind of a must kill in the late game, because you can theoretically get to the point where you have so much mana, you just play it and activate the exhaust ability right away, and dump everything into play, and I'm not sure how anyone actually beats that. We also got Sita Varma Mast Racer. So this is our Simic 2-drop, 2 mana 2/3 legendary human rogue. It has exhaust of green, green, blue, and X to put X +1/+1 counters on it, and then you can have the base power and toughness of each other creature you control become equal to its power until end of turn. So Sita Varma, yeah, I don't think this card is especially powerful. So yeah, it's cool that you can put a bunch of counters on it. The problems I see with this one is, first off, you gotta go super wide to make it work. And then even if you make its ability work and you make your team huge, you're not really getting any evasion there, right? So your opponent can still theoretically chump block because the ability's only gonna last for that turn. Like, for the turn, your creatures are gonna get really, really big. But if your opponent survives that turn, sure, you get a big set of Varma, but all your other creatures are gonna go back to their normal size. So I feel like this is probably just too many hoops to jump through. We don't really have a Simic go wide deck in Standard. So if you want to try to build around it in Commander, I think there's ways to make it work, but doesn't really look like a Standard card to me. Although, I don't know, it's going to be in Standard for like 3 years, so maybe it develops at some point. We also got a new red vehicle with exhaust in Boommobile. So a 4 mana 5/5 vehicle. When it enters, you add 4 mana of any one color, except you can only use it to activate abilities. And then it has exhaust of red, 2, and X. To have this vehicle deal X damage to any target, and then put a +1/+1 counter on the vehicle. I gotta say, if you notice those +1/+1 counters randomly attached to exhaust, I am 99% sure that's just for tracking purposes, and then you'll know, well, I have a counter on my Boommobile, so I probably activated it if you forget for some reason. So as a fair card, I guess you just try to ramp into it and you play it, you get back the 4 mana for abilities. If you have like Overlord of the Hauntwoods, Virtuous Strength, enough mana, in theory, since it deals damage to any target, you could just burn your opponent right out of the game with it. I think the most likely way this sees play, though, is as some sort of combo piece. I'm not sure the best way to make it work. I guess like in Commander, you could go infinite with like Deadeye Navigator and March of the Machines. So March of the Machines make Boommobile into a creature, and then Deadeye Navigator soul bonds with it, and then the Boommobile makes 4 mana, use 2 of that mana to blink it, and make 4 mana, 2 to blink it, make 4 mana. So you make infinite mana, and then with the infinite mana, you just dump it all into Boommobile itself and burn your opponent out of the game. I think that's maybe the most likely way for this card to actually be good, is this some sort of weird infinite combo piece, where if you can make infinite mana, this does allow you to just win the game on the spot. And if you can blink this enough times, it can make infinite mana by itself. Maybe you can do something similar with Displacer Kitten in the right shell, where you keep blinking this to generate a whole bunch of mana and then eventually dump it into the Boommobile to burn your opponent out of the game. So I feel like this is mostly a weird combo vehicle. I feel like seeing fair play, probably unlikely. It doesn't have any evasion or anything, but I think there's ways you could build around this to maybe turn it into a ridiculous combo piece to take advantage of its 4 mana ETB trigger. We also got Draconautics Engineer, a 3 mana 2/2 Goblin Artificer. It has 2 exhaust. Its first one, 1 red mana. Other creatures you control get haste until end of turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on the Engineer. And then exhaust number 2 for 4 mana. Create a 4/4 red dinosaur dragon creature token with flag. So Draconautics Engineer. I feel like this was probably supposed to be a Goro at one point, and then they changed the character or something, because this card is an awful lot like Goro. It's kind of the same thing, except you can only use it once, and it doesn't care about modified, and it's not legendary, I guess, but its abilities are strikingly similar. Goro never really saw a ton of play in Standard, but I think things might be different for the Engineer, so I don't think this is going to make it in mono red. I feel like we just have better options, but this is a Goblin, and we actually have a lot of pieces for a Goblin deck. Runfelt Hordemaster, Sear Slicer Goblin, and most importantly, Krenko. So when Krenko was reprinted into Standard in Foundations, my first thought was, I want to build a Krenko deck. My second thought was, Krenko really needs haste, and without haste, Krenko just doesn't work. I feel like Draconautics Engineer might be the card to make Krenko Mob Boss work, because if you can get down Engineer and then play Krenko, for 1 mana you give it haste, tap it, make a bunch of goblins, and then the Krenko snowball has begun. So I'm actually very excited to see if maybe we can make goblins work in Standard, in large part thanks to the power of Draconautics Engineer. Otherwise, it feels like a fine card, although I kind of think this is one of the cards where you see some of the downsides of 3-year Standard. As much as there's upsides to 3-year Standard, which we've seen, there is a downside that you're competing with a lot of other cards, and it might be the Draconautics Engineer, even though it's a fine red 2-drop, might not be quite as good as some of the other options that exist with such a big card pool. Next up, we have Angonasaur Rex, and I'm not sure I've ever seen a card before that I was 100% convinced was an example of power creep, but also 100% convinced is probably not going to have hardly any impact on Standard. So Angonasaur Rex, 5 mana, 8/8 Trampler, just jaw-dropping stats. Even in 2025, 5 mana, 8/8 Trample is kind of insane. And then it has cycling for 3. And when you cycle it, you can put 2 counters on up to 1 target creature or vehicle, and it gains trample and indestructible until end of turn. If you think about what this is what Giganosaurus wanted to be. I know Timmy's love Giganosaurus, but Giganosaurus, in all honesty, without trample or anything, 5 mana 10/10, I would much rather have a 5 mana 8/8 with trample than a 5 mana 10/10 without trample. But it's essentially what Giganosaurus wanted to be, mixed with kind of a less flexible Tyver stand, where you cycle this to get some counters, get some trample, give your thing indestructible until end of turn. The problem with Angonasaur Rex is, I just don't know where you play it. Like, we're in a Standard with Sunfall, and this town ain't big enough, and go for the throw. So I feel like you're just setting yourself up for a disaster. If you play this card, then your opponent's going to be like, oh, this town ain't big enough. I bounce it, I pick up my discard, I do it again. Like, that's just how it's going to play out. It's just going to die too often. We're just not in a format where these big dinosaurs can really do their thing. I don't know how we change that. I don't know how we get to a Standard where a card like Angonasaur Rex is actually good. But I feel like this is a really incredibly power creepy card that, worst case, this is a card that I feel like I would just play in every dinosaur commander deck of all time, where not only do I get another on-curve dinosaur, but it can also be protection for my more important dinosaurs, like my Gishath or my Zakama or whatever. So I think this is a really good card. I'm just skeptical of big green stompy creatures actually working in Standard. We also got a new black removal spell in Quag Feast. So 2-mana sorcery, choose target creature, planeswalker, or vehicle, mill 2 cards, then destroy the chosen permanent if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of cards in your graveyard. It's a whole lot of text and weirdness for what seems like kind of a medium removal spell. So the good news is this gets any planeswalker, any creature, or any vehicle, and those are all card types that see a lot of play in Standard. The bad news is, number one, it's sorcery speed, and I remember when people were really hyped about Fel, because it was just destroy any creature for 2 mana, but it turns out being a sorcery is a really, really big deal with removal, doubly so in this Standard, with Leyline of Resonance and haste creatures all over the place. So I'm just not sure you can get away with playing the sorcery speed removal spell, especially in a world where you're competing with Go for the Throat and Nowhere to Run and Annoying with Affliction and Shield and Sita can blot out in the end. There's so many other good black removal spells. It's nice that it mills some cards, although there's also a downside there where if your graveyard gets locked down, you might not have enough cards in your graveyard to kill the thing that you want to kill. The other thing about this card that is interesting is it targeting vehicles. We've talked a lot recently about black getting enchantment removal for the first time ever. Vehicles or artifacts, this is kind of black getting artifact removal, which traditionally is something black is just not allowed to touch. I imagine the reason that Wizards did this is because it's a sorcery, and during your turn, your opponent's vehicles are most likely going to be in artifact form, not in creature form, and Wizards want you to be able to interact with them because of the set. Although it does make me a little worried that we're heading down a slippery slope, and like 3 years from now, we just get straight up black disenchant or something. But anyway, this card I think is pretty harmless, and I would honestly be surprised if it saw much play. Maybe there's some graveyard deck that's so desperate to fill the graveyard, it gets away with it. But outside of some sort of dedicated graveyard deck, I think we just have better options in Standard. We also got Caradora, Heart of Elsira, and this card is pretty cool. So 4 mana, 4/2. When it enters, you can tutor for a mount or a vehicle, reveal, put it in your hand, and then if one or more counters would be put on a creature or vehicle you control, +1/+1 counters, you put that many +1/+1/+1 counters on it instead. So essentially, it's a tutor for a vehicle or a mount. There's also a hardened scales on the battlefield. And the question is, do we have good enough stuff for tutor up? Like 4 mana for a 4/2 that also tutors and replaces itself seems pretty fine. Seems cute with the Gitrog. That was the first thing I thought of is, I can play this, get my Gitrog. The next turn, I can use this to saddle my Gitrog, draw a bunch of cards, do a bunch of ramping. That seems like it could be pretty sweet. Plus, we're getting a ton of new vehicles in the set. So tutors are as strong as what they can tutor for. So I think we're basically wait and see mode to see if we can get enough good vehicles and good mounts for this to be a playable card. Worst case, it is a commander, right? It's a legend, so you could play this as your commander and just repeatedly tutor, which sounds super fun. Maybe we can have a mount deck in Standard. One of the things I love about having mounts return in Aether Drift is it's going to synergize with the mounts that we got back in Outlaws of Thunder Junction a year ago, and so far mounts have just not been good enough. Like, they have seen very little Standard play. Some of them have seen play like in other decks, but we haven't seen a mount deck at all. Maybe now with this card combined with Frontier Seeker and some of the stuff that we got from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, maybe we can make like an actual mount deck work now. So Caradora seems like a sweet card. Tutor on a stick, gonna see play somewhere. We'll have to wait and see how good our vehicles and mounts are. We also got Captain Howler Sea Scourge. So a 4 mana 5/4 with Ward of 2 and pay 2 life. It's a shark pirate. Says whenever you discard one or more cards, target creature gets +2/+0 till end of turn for each card discarded this way. Whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player this turn, you draw a card. Reminds me a lot of Real the Everwise. There's not that many cards that reward you for discarding your own cards. So it's kind of neat to see an Is It legend that isn't just doing spell slingery stuff. This is the kind of legend I want to see more of. When Wizards prints all these legends, I want to see legends that do unique things, open up new space in Commander, and I think that Captain Howler is one of those cards. Yeah, it's similar to Tyrell in some ways, but really compared to just like, hey, I'm Izzet, cast a bunch of spells, I'm going to be good, I like that this is pushing in a very different build around direction. So what do we do with Captain Howler? First off, if I'm understanding the formatting of this card right, and correct me if I'm wrong, and we might have to wait until we actually get the full rules released in a couple weeks to know for sure, but if I'm understanding how Captain Howler works correctly, it's going to work best with effects that discard one card repeatedly compared to effects that discard a whole bunch of cards. So why would this matter? So let's say you cast a Wheel of Fortune. You discard your hand, you draw 7 cards. So you're going to pump a creature +2/+0 for each card you discarded. But when that creature deals combat damage, you will draw a single card. On the other hand, let's say you get an Artist Talent that lets you loot repeatedly. Let's say somehow you discard 7 cards to Artist Talent. If I'm understanding this right, your creature's still going to get +14/+0, the same amount of buff as you would get with the Wheel of Fortune, but I believe you will get 7 separate instances of when this creature deals combat damage, you get to draw a card. So in theory, if you discarded 7 cards individually and hit with that creature, you would just draw 7 more cards and refill your hand, which is kind of ridiculous. So if that is how this works and that formatting is correct, I feel like this is actually a really cool build around card. Also, it seems like just a good wheel commander. Like if you want to play a wheel deck, play all the wheels, you're going to grow your team a ton, you're going to loot through your deck, and you're going to get in a ton of damage. In Standard, there's not a ton of synergies for this, and is it? I think maybe the best is Invasion of Kaladesh, that you flip into Pyre of the World Tree, and then you can discard land cards to deal 2 damage, and when you discard them, you're going to trigger your Captain Howler to hopefully get a damage and draw a bunch of cards, plus you get to play the cards you exile with Pyre of the World Tree. So I feel like that could be a neat deck to build, some sort of hit our swans, draw some cards style deck. Also seems really good with NT. NT is probably the most powerful discard effect that we have in Standard. So maybe there's some Izzet aggro deck where you use NT to discard and get trample, and then Captain Howler makes the creature even bigger, and then you draw a card when it deals combat damage. It also could be a weird combo piece with 1 with nothing. Maybe this is the card that makes 1 with nothing good, or Seismic Assault, Zombie Infestation, anything that just lets you discard repeatedly. And it'd be really, really sweet with Captain Howler. So I think this will be one of the more popular commanders from the set. I think that having Word of 2 maybe gives it some chance to see play in Standard. Remember, this is a card that's going to have to stick around for a couple of turns for it to do its thing. If you just tap out and 4, it does nothing. In a world with this town ain't big enough, bouncing everything, without that ward, this just wouldn't really have a chance. But maybe that ward gives us a chance to at least build a super sweet self-discard deck around Captain Howler in Standard. We also got Aetherspark Emerald Radion, a 6-mana 3/3 legendary insect druid. When it enters, you create a 1/1 green insect creature token for each artifact and/or creature in your graveyard, and when an insect you control dies, put a counter on it, and each opponent loses a life. If this looks familiar, it is very, very, very similar to a Zoni Thousand Eyes. It's basically a Zoni with its stats twisted a little bit, and it works with artifacts as well as creatures in your graveyard. So I think that this is a card that probably isn't going to see Standard play. I think it's just a little bit too much mana. There's too much graveyard hate with Omniscience stacks running around, but it could be a fun commander card. I imagine all you really got to do is like fill your graveyard and have a sack outlet, and you play this, make a huge amount of insects, sack them all, and this kind of has a built-in Blood Artist effect, right? Where each insect that dies, you make your opponents lose a life. If you get enough creatures and artifacts in your graveyard with a sack outlet, all you really got to do is play this from your command zone and sack everything and win the game on the spot. Plus, it seems good in the 99 of other insect decks. Insects, they've been in Magic forever, but it's really only the last few years that Wizards has heavily supported them. So if you want to build an insect, you still want like every good way that you can make an insect possible. So I think that we'll see this show up in a lot of decks like the Swarm Reaver, Asm, Grist the Hunger Tide as well. So Aetherspark, probably a bit too expensive for Standard, but seems like a super fun build around in Commander. We also got an Oxbow in Bulwark Ox. So 2-mana 2/2. Whenever this creature attacks by saddled, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. You can saddle it for 1, and then you can sack it to give creatures you control with counters on them hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So this card, not a ton to really say about it. It just seems really good in a deck with a bunch of counters, especially for that sacrifice mode. If you're a deck that's constantly putting counters on your entire team, this is a 2-drop with upside that can put some counters on things, and you can always just sacrifice it to mostly save your team, unless it's a Sunfall, but in general, it should save your team. So in Standard, we got a lot of pieces for some sort of saddle counter deck. Warden of the Inner Sky, Paw Patch, Innkeeper's Talent. These are all ways to put counters on things, including themselves. And then Ornery Tumblewag also wants to be saddled and puts counters on things. So I'm definitely going to try Green-White Saddle. We'll see how it lines up with the meta, but I think that Bulwark Ox should be really good in that deck. And then in Commander, if you're playing any +1/+1 counter kind of deck, Shalayan Alar, Hamza, Sovereign Anatakao, even a Troxa if you're a counters-themed deck, I think this is probably worth a slot in your deck as an on-theme way to protect your team from a board wipe. So I think it's a really solid card there as well. We also got a new Basri, and Basri tomorrow's champion. So 1 mana 2/1. So a legendary Human Knight Savannah Lions. You can pay 1 tap it and exert it so it doesn't untap on your next untap step to make a 1/1 cat creature token with lifelink. You can cycle it for 3, and when you cycle it, cats you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So I feel like Basri, this card is great for cats. We actually just played cats not that long ago, and I would totally run maybe the full 4 copies of Basri in the deck, just as removal protection. Like, it's fine as a 1-drop. You can play it. You can tap it to make some cats to work with your Caracals and Sky Knights and Arabos. But then, if you draw extra copies, you just cycle them away. It's a really sneaky way to get around the legend rule problem. If you draw too many Basris, just cycle it, get a new card, and maybe fizzle a targeted removal spell, even fizzle a Wrath with Basri. So I feel like staple for standard cats may be good enough for just generic white aggro. Like, it's a Savannah Lions with upside. Yeah, the cycling to protect your cats isn't going to be great, but cycling in the late game just to draw something more impactful than a Savannah Lions, that's still an upside. So it is a legend. I'd probably only play like a copy, but I could see some of the like Convoke style decks maybe try a copy of Basri. It is weak to Sunfall. I feel like I've said that a ton this video, but a lot of cards are weak to Sunfall, which, yeah, it's just Sunfall stuff. The other place this card is going to be great is in any cat commander deck. If you're playing a Johnny Nakato Praya, a Rabo Roar of the World, Rin and Siri, choose a cat commander, play this card in your deck, cycle it to protect your team. It's like a spell that's also a creature, so I feel like really, really good cat card. So Basri tomorrow's champion. We'll see how good cats are in Standard, but I'm definitely putting this in my cat deck. Maybe some White Weenie potential, and just a staple for cat decks in Commander. We also got a really cool Boros commander in Culloden Triumph Caster. So one thing I've been critical of is how a lot of Boros commanders are just boring equipment commanders that all do the same thing. Well, Culloden, a little bit different. It's a 2-mana 2/3 human pilot. It says mounts and vehicles you control have haste. Whenever a mount you control enters, it becomes saddled until end of turn. Whenever a vehicle you control enters, it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. So essentially, if you play this and play a mount or a saddle, you just haste them in. They're automatically saddled. They're automatically crewed to hit your opponent for a huge amount of damage. So as far as mounts go, this is going to be at its best with some of the cards that care about being saddled, like Seraphic Steed. It has a really high saddle cost at 4, but if you saddle it and attack, you get a 3/3 White Angel for free. Now with Culloden, you don't need to worry about any of this. You just play Culloden, play the Seed. It's automatically going to count as saddle. You attack, you get the Angel. Same with like Ornery Tumblewag. Just be warned. There are some saddle cards that this doesn't really work with, like Calamity, for example, makes copies of the thing that saddles it. That's not really going to do anything with Culloden. The other place this is fun is just with big vehicles. You just like haste in your Valor's Flagship. You don't got to worry about crewing it, or your Parhelion. You don't got to worry about crewing it. Smash your opponent for a huge amount of damage. This is a card I'm excited to try in a Pioneer deck we played a while ago. I don't know if you remember the Mr. Plow deck that was built around Consulate Dreadnought. This 6 to crew 7/11 for 1 vehicle. It seems insane with Culloden. You play Culloden, and then on turn 3, in theory, you could drop 3 Consulate Dreadnoughts. They're all 7/11s. They're all automatically crewed and hasty, hit your opponent for 21. So with like Colossal Plow and Priest Walker Colossus, definitely gonna have to revisit that because Culloden seems like the perfect addition to that deck. In all this stuff, you can also just do it in Commander. I think these same synergies is how you want to play Culloden. Just overload with the sweetest mounts, the sweetest vehicles, and trust that your commander at only 2 mana is gonna make all those cards super good. So one of my favorite Boros commanders we've gotten in a minute. Super fun to see something outside of just the typical equipment synergy. synergies. We also got Repurposing Bay, a 3-mana blue artifact that is essentially birthing pod for artifacts. You pay to sack another artifact, search your library for an artifact card with mana value equal to 1 plus its mana value, put the card on the battlefield, shuffle, activate only as a sorcery. So when I first saw Repurposing Bay, my immediate thought was, how do we combo with this? It's a birthing pod. It's a Oswald Fiddlebender. How do we turn this into a game-ending combo piece? And I started looking, and I got to, like, I can tutor up a corridor monitor and untap it, and then I think the chain fizzles. So I haven't found a birthing pod-esque infinite combo chain where it's like, I play this with a creature on the battlefield, and I do a bunch of things, and the end result is I win the game. Maybe it's out there somewhere, and I haven't found it yet. If you have ideas of how to turn this into a one-shot kill, as soon as I play it, I win combo piece, definitely let me know in the comments, because I want to try building it, but I haven't found the combo yet. So how can we use this card? And I think there's actually a lot of options. So if you think about standard, I think this might just be a great fair card in an artifact deck. Think about like the artifacts we have in standard. Spring-loaded Sawblade is like a removal spell. Simulacrum Synthesizer makes Hume's Body Solemn Simulacrum to ramp and draw cards, and Mightstone and Weakstone is removal. Nexus of Becoming is a finisher. In theory, you just like play a Spring-loaded Sawblade, then you sack it to Repurposing Blade, get the Simulacrum Synthesizer, then you sack it and get the Solemn, and sack it, get the Mightstone and Weakstone, sack it, get the Nexus of Becoming. Over the course of a few turns, you're just going to generate a huge amount of fair value. So I'm excited to try this in blue-white artifacts without any combos, just like fairly working my way up the chain. Also seems really good with affinity for artifacts, where you can make Mirror Enforcer free thanks to affinity, but it's technically a 7-drop, and then you just sack it to Repurposing Bay, get a Sundering Titan, a Platinum Empyrean, a big finisher. Also, in Commander, this can be a good way to assemble artifact combos, like Basalt Monolith Rings of the Bright Earth. If you get both of these on the battlefield, you can get infinite mana. Well, with Repurposing Bay, you can sack random signets, other 2-mana artifacts, and just find your combo pieces in your 100-card singleton deck. So if you're an artifact deck in Commander, I think you just play this as a way to find your combos, play it for value. You do want to think a little bit about your curve and make sure your mana values work out right, but I think you can jam this in any Urza deck, a Mishra deck, basically any artifact deck, and it's probably going to be good enough. So Repurposing Bay, sweet value card, Commander stable for artifact decks, and possibly some infinite combo pod potential too, if we can find the right pieces. All right, we are going to wrap things up today by lightning moding through some weird stuff, because this video already ended up being way longer than I expected. So special guests are back. We've only seen one so far, but it's a good one. It's a Mox, sadly not Mox Opal, but it is Chrome Mox, which is still like a $100 card for its cheapest version. And I imagine that this version will be pretty expensive, especially the yellow one, which I believe is the more rare one. For a rare land cycle, we got the other half of the Verge lands, which we badly needed just to make the mana consistent in standard. Pretty awkward that some colors had better mana than other colors, but this will fix it now that we have all 10 Verges in the format. Reprint wise, only one big one today, and that's Bloodghast, which financially only like a $6 card, but it's a pretty playable card. If you don't remember Bloodghast, it's a landfall thing that keeps coming back into play whenever you make a land drop. It can't block, but it gets haste as long as you have 10 or less life. Mostly sees play in graveyard decks, sometimes sacrifice style decks. We've seen like Skyclave Shade, Mosswood Dread Knight be pretty good in standard as recursive 2-drops. Bloodghast does something kind of similar, although it does also die to similar things, and that might be an issue in this standard, even outside of Sunfall. Torch the Tower is really popular. Elspeth's Might, Anoint with Affliction. That's like 3 of the 5 colors have a popular 1 or 2 mana exile-based removal spell. So we'll have to wait and see if Bloodghast is that good this time around with the removal we have in the format, but it is a good way to repeatedly crew vehicles. Like if your opponent kills it, you just keep getting it back, so it's a way you can always be crewing something. Works really well in graveyard decks, and we have a lot of graveyard synergies in standard. So maybe in a cash grab, Sita Ho, Picklock Prankster style deck, this is free value. You just mill it over, make a land drop, and suddenly get a bunch of power on the battlefield. The other place I'm really hyped for this is in Pioneer. We've never had Bloodghast in Pioneer. Could show up in vampire decks, but I think its best home is probably going to be like Dredgeless Dredge, where this joins Narcomoeba is another creature that if you mill it over, you can get into play from your graveyard, which gives you another way to get back your prized amalgams, which kind of makes the whole synergies work. I think we're like one card short of building Dredgeless Edge and Pioneer, and I think Bloodghast might just be that card. So definitely gonna have to try some Pioneer graveyard shenanigans now that Bloodghast is around, and it could have some standard ramifications too. Worst case, it's like a $6 rare, so not a bad reprint financially. We also got the 4 face commanders from the Commander precons. We get the full Commander deck list Thursday and Friday of this week. I'm not going to get into these cards, but Tomer did a whole video over on the MTG Goldfish Commander channel. It's already up talking about these sweet new legends. And then, of course, we get a bunch of lower rarity stuff, some weird vehicle or mount lands, and then a bunch of just kind of draft chat filler stuff that you can check out over on mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Ether Drift spoilers for today, and it was a big one. We had a ridiculous number of cards. Let me know what you think. Now that you've seen a decent chunk of this set, what's your hype level at? What are you feeling about Ether Drift? What card's your favorite? What are you most excited to build? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Ether Drift spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon.